The ripple effect, how the war in Ukraine shook global finance and living standards. Imagine the global economy as a massive interconnected domino chain. Every country, trade relationship, and financial market is one of the dominoes in this intricate system. Now imagine one of these key dominoes, Ukraine, suddenly collapsing due to war. What happens next? The entire world's financial structure starts to tremble. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, it was like an economic earthquake that shook markets around the globe. But this war isn't just about military strategy or territorial disputes. It has drastically altered how countries trade, how markets behave, and how people live, whether they realize it or not. Let's break down the specific impacts. Energy prices skyrocket, the global power struggle. One of the war's most immediate effects was on energy markets. Russia is a major exporter of oil and natural gas, particularly to Europe. When sanctions were imposed on Russian energy, Europe, one of the largest consumers of Russian gas, faced a severe energy shortage. This sent prices for gas and oil skyrocketing worldwide. Europe, a cold winter looms. European nations, particularly Germany, which relied heavily on Russian gas, saw energy prices soar to unprecedented levels. With winter approaching, there were real fears of energy rationing, power cuts, and families being unable to heat their homes. This created economic pressure on European governments to find alternative energy sources quickly. Ripple effects on global energy prices. The hike in energy prices wasn't limited to Europe. The global price of oil surged as countries scrambled to find new suppliers, impacting transportation, shipping, and manufacturing costs. Countries like the US saw gasoline prices rise sharply, putting pressure on consumers and contributing to inflation. In developing countries, the rising cost of energy made it harder for governments to subsidize fuel, which is crucial for keeping everyday life affordable. Food crisis. The breadbasket of Europe goes silent. Ukraine and Russia together are major global suppliers of wheat, barley, and sunflower oil. In fact, Ukraine is often called the breadbasket of Europe. But the war disrupted Ukrainian agricultural production and halted grain exports through the Black Sea, leading to a global food crisis. Famine risk in developing countries. Countries in the Middle East and Africa, which rely heavily on Ukrainian grain imports, found themselves facing food shortages. Nations like Egypt, one of the world's largest importers of wheat, saw food prices soar, leading to increased hunger and unrest. The United Nations even warned that the war could push millions into famine. Higher grocery bills everywhere. Even in wealthier nations, food prices increased. Grain is a fundamental ingredient in many processed foods, and disruptions in supply chains pushed grocery bills higher across Europe, North America, and Asia. This increase in the cost of living affected millions of households already struggling with post-pandemic economic challenges. Inflation, a global monster. Inflation, which had already started rising due to supply chain disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic, received an additional boost from the war in Ukraine. The combination of soaring energy prices and food shortages created a perfect storm for inflationary pressure worldwide. Central banks take action. In response, central banks in the US, Europe, and elsewhere began raising interest rates to combat inflation. While these measures are designed to cool down overheated economies, they also make borrowing more expensive. For businesses and consumers, mortgage rates increased, making housing less affordable, and companies faced higher costs for financing expansion, which dampened economic growth. Just quick interruption. If you like this content, subscribe my channel and give me your thoughts in comment. Let's continue. A hit to disposable income. For ordinary people, rising prices meant that their incomes could no longer stretch as far as they once did. Whether it was the cost of heating their homes, filling up their cars, or buying basic groceries, consumers worldwide found themselves facing a financial squeeze. In some countries, this led to protests and political instability as citizens demanded government intervention. Global trade disruptions, supply chains under siege. The war in Ukraine didn't just affect energy and food markets, it also disrupted global trade routes. Ukraine is a major producer of metals such as steel and iron ore, which are essential for the manufacturing sector. The conflict disrupted Ukrainian production, leading to shortages of these materials in international markets. The semiconductor shortage worsens. The automotive and electronics industries, already reeling from a global semiconductor shortage caused by the pandemic, were hit once again. Ukraine is one of the world's largest suppliers of neon gas, a critical component in the production of semiconductors. The disruption of this supply chain further delayed the production of cars, smartphones, and other electronics, driving up prices for consumers. Shipping routes in peril. Furthermore, the war impacted global shipping routes, especially in the Black Sea region. Ships were at risk of attack, and insurance costs for vessels navigating these waters skyrocketed, adding another layer of expense to global trade. Geopolitical realignment, the birth of new alliances. As the war dragged on, the geopolitical landscape began to shift. Countries started to reassess their alliances and economic partnerships, leading to a realignment of global power structures. The West versus Russia, sanctions and financial warfare. Western nations, led by the US and the European Union, imposed harsh economic sanctions on Russia. These included freezing Russian assets abroad, cutting off Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system, and banning imports of Russian oil and gas. While these measures were designed to cripple the Russian economy, they also had significant significant collateral effects on global markets. Russian retaliatory measures, such as limiting gas exports to Europe, only exacerbated the energy crisis. Furthermore, Russia began pivoting its economic and trade relationships toward countries like China and India, signaling a shift away from the West. This marked the beginning of a new phase in global financial realignment, where nations may increasingly seek to diversify their economic dependencies. Living standards take a hit. All of these factors, rising energy costs, food shortages, inflation, and trade disruptions, combined to lower the standard of living for millions of people around the world. The war's impacts were felt differently in various regions, but no one was immune. Europe, struggling to adjust in Europe, particularly in countries like Germany, Italy, and Poland, which were heavily reliant on Russian energy and Ukrainian exports. Governments were forced to introduce emergency subsidies and energy-saving measures. Citizens faced higher utility bills, and governments encouraged households to reduce energy consumption. Developing nations, a crisis within a crisis. In developing nations, the impact was even more severe. Countries already dealing with the economic fallout from the pandemic found themselves grappling with food shortages and skyrocketing prices for basic goods. For many, the war in Ukraine meant the difference between stability and economic collapse. The US and China, different realities. In the US, the war contributed to record-high inflation rates not seen in decades. While the US is less reliant on Russian energy, global energy market disruptions still impacted gasoline and heating costs. China, on the other hand, saw opportunities amid the crisis, deepening its ties with Russia and benefiting from discounted energy imports, even as it grappled with its own economic challenges. Conclusion: a global conflict with global consequences. The war in Ukraine is far more than just a regional conflict. Its ripple effects have spread across the globe, destabilizing markets, disrupting trade, and lowering the standard of living for millions. While some countries have managed to mitigate the worst effects, others, especially developing nations, are facing severe economic hardship. This war has forced the world to rethink its economic dependencies, reconfigure supply chains, and prepare for a new era of global financial uncertainty. The next few years will be critical in determining how well the global economy can adapt to these challenges. As the war continues, one thing is clear: no one is truly insulated from its effects. Whether it's the cost of filling your car with gas, buying bread at the store, or paying your heating bill, the conflict in Ukraine has changed the financial landscape and life for all of us. This deep dive into the impact of the Ukraine war highlights just how interconnected our world has become. From energy crises to food shortages, the fallout is felt globally, affecting both everyday people and nations at large. Don't forget to subscribe Success Moves so you'll have access to new videos. Give us like and share your thoughts about war. Was in Ukraine? Bellow in the comments.